carbon credits and ecosystemic services in Africa in ecosystems. And I call upon the panelists to join me. We have Madame Arlette, the Minister for Development in Congo, Executive Secretary of Climate Change in the Congo Basin. Dr. Claudine Uwera, Senior Strategic Advisor, Office of the Prime Minister of Rwanda.
Dr. Valérie Lietchi.
Dr. Valérie Lietchi, Assistant Director General at Head of Africa Division, Swiss Agency Development and Cooperation Agency.
Professor
Pushpam Kumar, Chief Environmental Economist, UNEP. Tierno Habib Han, MD Shelter Afrique.
Professor Gunnar Cholin.
Professor Gunnar Collin, Associate Professor and Senior Advisor, Environment for Development Initiative at University of Gothenburg. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for accepting to participate in this panel discussion. I have a question to all of you based on your profile, and you're free to answer. The first question: Africa holds some of the most valuable resources in Africa, in the world, yet it is dependent on external funding. What should you do to transform this in fiscal resources and financial resources? Madam Minister, probably we'll start with you. Thank you. I'll go first. Listen, this is an essential question. Africa today, probably need to recall, is the breadbasket of humanity when it comes to climate change, because everything that we're doing is for humanity's survival, our well-being, our development, which takes into consideration natural resources. But Africa should start, I think, talking with one voice. We have a specificity of all the global ecosystems. We have a continent which has a continental body, AU, with 54 countries. And this is a first in Africa. This institution should bring together all the documents that we have through the different conventions, like Paris Accord, the Nairobi Declaration on natural resources today, because we need to talk about quantification and inventory of all these natural resources that we have. We have the documents that enable us to speak with one voice. This is the NDCs, which is presented every 5 years in COP discussions that we all know. But unfortunately, once the curtain comes down, generally, there is no implementation. Oftentimes, the economists, those who are charged with the planning, struggle to translate these NDCs that should impact on the economy, because that is the cross-cutting instrument to quantify all the emissions of all the sectors of the economic life, or just life of a country in general. That's what I could say as a first instance. Who would like to pick up on Madam the Minister's remarks?
Claudine, peut-être?
Claudine, maybe you? Yes, thank you very much. Like the Excellency of the Minister has said, I think Africa is endowed with natural resources in sufficient quantities, and to say that Africa has natural resources and Africa is poor is actually a paradox, and that reminds me this theory that says that Africa is awash with national resources, but there is a curse behind that, and that's something that we cannot accept as African countries. My country, Rwanda, has understood this. We started to quantify natural capital and integrate that in the economy, and we want to integrate this, and the minister has just said that accounting is important, and I think that is a crux of the matter today. From 2012, you recall the declaration that was made in Gaborone in Botswana, where Africa committed to integrate natural capital in its economy. But from that time, 2012, up to 2026, like Madam Minister has underscored, when it comes to implementation, nothing much has been done. And having natural resources and not knowing how to account for them, not to integrate them in the GDP, is to underestimate what we have as Africa. For me, if I can summarize that question of integrating natural capital in our economic system and in all the fiscal reforms that we are doing, that is important. That's the most important of the things that we can do. Madam Mushman, where do we start to get this done? Professor Pushman.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. As Honorable Minister has already said, that Africa has a rich natural capital base. In our estimate done by UNEP, during 1992 and 2020, the 38% in the total wealth, suppose we take the total wealth, which comprises produced capital like machine, equipment, and building, natural capital, and human capital, more than half is human capital, which is easy to see because the young populations, people who are not handicapped and willing to work from 15 to 60 years of age, they are in big number, and followed by natural capital, that is 38%. But the question is why a natural capital rich region remains poor region? The fact is, number one, natural capital is not being integrated with the economic performances, number one. Secondly, the way we are measuring our measure of progress, call it GDP, has very limited assets and production boundary, and it does not capture the hydrological functions, bioremediation by water bodies, carbon by forest. One can go on. And those things remain outside the production boundary, and that is why a rich nation, a rich region, is called as the poor region. In fact, 2 weeks back, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed recommended that what are the ways to go beyond GDP, and report has been launched. And there are many initiatives happening that must trickle down in this part of the world. Of course, Africa Development Bank under Dr. Kevin Orama is doing a lot, but we need to give a big push to create a, what you call the community of practitioners and have proper data and capacity. But that is a long shot. We have to do a lot of things. I will come back in the next question once the time comes. Thanks.
Anne.
Cecily, I question you. Do you have something to say based on what Professor has said? Thank you very much. Absolutely.
you know, just like any new innovations, repeating myself, new and innovation, because every time we have these great initiatives, I think the issue is about implementation. So we have policies, we have a lot of write-ups and a lot of reports, right? The whole point is, how do we develop actors in the private sector to really address this particular challenge, right? So we talk about carbon credits, and I've been in many discussions about how Africa can actually leverage the carbon credits market, but what I'm hearing from all those discussions is not working. And it's not working because we have forgotten to actually empower the private sector that is supposed to make it happen. This takes me back my Wall Street days when I used to be at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan in New York. We're talking about this whole private equity development across Africa, and a lot of it was happening from New York or London to Africa. And then at some point, we actually disrupted that market by having some of us move on the continent, on the private sector, and start launching indigenous, locally driven PEs, private equity funds. So when we're talking about carbon credits today, I think we should be in a position where we can actually empower and create the actors that can develop that market on the continent. Because look, let's be real, right? Every single continent or country has its own priorities, and they have their own issues to deal with. So the market is very big and large. So let's see how we develop the carbon market on the continent, bring the private sector on board, build capacity, build players, so that it becomes a commercially viable environment. So beyond policy, beyond reports, let's create the market.
Merci. Professeur Cholin.
Thank you. Perhaps one last statement to close the discussion on the conversion of these resources, this green wealth, to general sustainability in the financial sense.
Yes, so this is basically the trillion-dollar question, right? And I'm so happy to be here today, and I'm so happy that the African Development Bank, and particularly as Professor Kumar says, under the leadership of the chief economist, have been addressing this issue, and not only this year. So already for the African Economic Outlook 2023, we had a whole chapter on exactly how to draw on these resources we're talking about, and they are huge. I mean, we're talking about more than $6 trillion worth of natural resources, probably much more. At the same time, the countries don't really get the revenues from it. So, as have been mentioned, and this report that we are now talking about today, valuing the green wealth of nations, it's the number one issue is, of course, to put a proper value so that we can utilize what we have here. So that's number one. But then also we really need to think about fiscal instruments to draw more on these resources. And I was very happy to be part of the African Economic Outlook 2023. We had a whole taxonomy of leakages. And I have this very, very unfortunate quote from that report. The money lost through various leakages is more than the total of foreign direct investments and overseas development assistance in Africa. Mining, oil and gas remain particularly prone to leakages. Of 1.2 trillion accrued from selling oil, gas and minerals, only 22% of the proceeds end up in national treasuries. So there is so much more we can do. And then, of course, as been mentioned on the credit architecture, that's very much behind this, that if we have proper valuation, we'll get better interest rates, and then, of course, innovative finance. So much to do.
Merci. Je voudrais donner...
Thank you. I will now give the floor to Valerie Ricci, because Switzerland has expertise in this area. You are the pioneer in financing of solutions related to nature and natural capital. In your view, how can Africans access green and blue large-scale funding, and how can bilateral partners add value to this? In relation to all the points that have already been raised, it is true that natural capital is under-evaluated, but we have three ways in which Switzerland is being active in extending this mechanism in scope. First, carbon markets. This was mentioned by fellow participants. Switzerland is interested in improving data quality and transparency and the application of carbon credits to increase the credibility of these carbon markets. For example, Switzerland has indeed been a pioneer in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We have been proactive in developing certain compensation projects. We have 7 of these projects on the African continent, in Tunisia, Morocco, Senegal, Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, just to give you these examples, but also Ghana. This helps to support projects such as clean stoves, transport, sustainable energy, which are included in part of the Switzerland's efforts in emissions, the reduction of emissions. We are aiming to reduce 40 million tons of CO2. So that is the first way in which our efforts are directed. Now, the scaling of green and blue funding, thanks to guarantees that include the African Development Bank's efforts. So we have blue bonds, which we support. We are working in West Africa on this matter, on the management of water resources, which are often cross-border. We are working with Senegal and Gambia to rebuild infrastructure in this area. We have Blue Peace, the Blue Peace initiative, which Switzerland founded and it supports since 2010. So that is with regard to the scaling of funding. Lastly, in the financial sector, we are seeking to increase investments. We have innovations. So there is exploring natural capital opportunities, and an NGO based in Geneva, which helps financial institutions to better understand the impact of natural capital and incorporate this impact in portfolio management. Reference has been made to what Rwanda has done. What are the obstacles to the incorporation of accounting of natural capital in national policies? And what solutions could be established to accelerate this process? I will speak in English this time.
To highlight that, as I did before, the problem is not that Africa is really poor in terms of endowment or having those natural wealth, but the problem is that environmental systems and economic systems normally work separately. We still have environmental data and the other data, economic data, being generated within different institutions, between different institutions and with different standards. And this, when it comes to informing the system of the national account, it becomes a problem. And when you see that there is the issue of climate change, land degradation, water stress, the biodiversity losses, all those impacts are not well captured in the economy, and those implications are not kind of accounted. So, which means that we have this those endowments, but once they are not captured in the economy due to the lack of the strong systems in terms of generating and integrating those environmental statistics into the GDP, this is one of the issues. Another barrier I would want to highlight is just capacity concentration. You know, this is a new field when it comes to integrating this natural asset into the economy, but looking at the requirement in terms of having all what is needed is just to inform the macroeconomic model, the geospatial analysis required, environmental economics expertise that is required. I think in the African context, this is also one of the issues, and this is where the focus should be as well. So another barrier I would like to highlight that is also key is the institution location. I mean, by giving an example where Rwanda we started with, when natural capital accounting program started and was supported by the World Bank, the natural capital, this program was located in the Ministry of Environment. But later on, we've seen that having it in the Ministry of Environment was really not enough just to inform our economy, to inform our resource mobilization. And then the government decided just to have the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning hosting this natural capital accounting in terms of policy. And again, it was not only that, we have our National Institute of Statistics. That's really also key in terms of generating and updating those data to inform the Ministry of Finance what's going on. So, which means that this location is also key. Another also important thing is the financing. You know, this program should not be treated, I mean, as a small, isolated project, since it informs the whole macro and fiscal systems. But having the required financing is really key for sustainability purpose. For example, for Rwanda, of course, we are in this process of institutionalizing this process. It started as a project-based, but now it's a program that's fully integrated into the planning, into the economy. The National Institute of Statistics is trying to gather data and standardize those information by expanding the systems and working with different ministries, environment, infrastructure, and then inform the Ministry of Planning what's going on. Of course, we still have a long way to go because we need to report on to comply with the system of environmental economic accounting, but it's a start. So, thank you.
Thank you. Madame la Ministre, alors comment...
Madam Minister, what are the challenges that we face to stimulate growth, employment, and competitiveness? I would like to perhaps return to something that we have raised, the carbon credits market. What we should bear in mind is that as long as we are not going to have the same view of how this should be done, how we should manage carbon credit markets, which is based on the Paris Agreement. This agreement is the instrument which in Articles 6 and 5 can enable states to access a sovereign market where prices for carbon tons are $50 to $100. Unfortunately, we have a run on the market. We have a Far West situation to the detriment of the Congo Basin, which I must say it's the first net carbon sequestrator in the cabinet. We sequester 1.5 million tons of carbon dioxide. When you talk about quantification of carbon stocks, we have 30 billion tons of CO2 in DRC and in the Republic of Congo. On 165,000 square kilometers, we talk about climate degradation, we are talking about funding, but there is the climate economy would enable us to preserve our planet, and that is not being taken into consideration. When I talk with economists and those in charge of planning, but whom are we fooling? Because we have all the scientific data. This is a rare thing. There is the science which has confirmed that today economists should be able to incorporate in the GDP of countries this accounting in terms of natural resources. Heads of state of the ADB have understood this. And that is why they have the C15 initiative to add value to natural capital. Unfortunately, we open doors, we leave them open, but we do not conclude the processes. We have climate change. We don't have a choice. We have to take account of it. We are bound to take account of this environmental risk and the risk of disequilibrium in the climate of the planet. We need to maintain the current temperature of our planet. So if we fail to take account ecosystem services which make the Congo Basin the heart of the planet, you can live without some of your lungs, but you cannot live without your heart. This is the breadbasket of the world in terms of natural capital, natural resources. And I wonder, in light of this, how we are really approaching this. I've talked about multilateralism. Now, at the bilateral level in Congo, specifically, we are instituting reforms. We need internal reforms. We need to change local domestic legislation. If we fail to incorporate a document, if we do not follow the obligations as recorded in the Paris Agreement, if we do not have NDCs, this document takes account of emissions in a country and it takes account of natural resources. If we use the NDCs to implement reforms. In our Sustainable Development Division, we have instituted reforms to set up NDCs. We calculate our natural resources. We are setting up an environmental service because people don't tell you in NDCs about biodiversity. It is carbon sequestration as well. I think we are beating about the bush. In Congo, just to speak of Congo, there are 15 billion tons of carbon stock in Congo-Brazzaville, and you multiply by $30 per ton, you see what it is. I would like to ask the professor what the best avenues are for integrating this accounting.
I would like to make a direct comment because, and this is of course a plug for the report that we are discussing here, valuing the green wealth of nations. So these heads of states that you mentioned, Minister, they insisted that we included in the report the values of carbon sequestration. And of course, for some countries, it's like, if you then multiply it by the ETS, it's like 340% of their GDP. I mean, as you mentioned, these are huge numbers, right? So what we did, we had like the typical voluntary carbon market price of $5, and then we took the $70 per ton of the ETS, just to show that kind of range, and we related that to the GDP. So you are absolutely right that there is an enormous potential here. So why can't you grasp this? And so we need to do, I think, our homework here on what it takes to create those institutions. In another project that we are running for funding by IDRC, we're looking at 6 African countries and ECOWAS, and looking at the actors and the institutions and the impact of those also carbon markets that was mentioned from Switzerland. And the sad fact is that African countries in most cases, you don't have the proper institutions to benefit from these markets. And the quality of these carbon credits, the credibility of these credits are not of the kind so that you would actually be able to get that money. So we need a lot of institutional reform to capture the proper value. I mean, ideally, and here, of course, the African Development Bank has a crucial role, and they initiated already in Sharm el-Sheikh, the African Carbon Markets Initiative, that, you know, imagine if we have something that is completely consistent with the Paris Agreement, the Article 6 market that we have heard about from Switzerland, the kind of money that you could attract. Final small point here. There is a time window here. There's been modeling of the marginal cost of abatement. And our economies in Sweden, Europe, North America, we are changing, electrifying. It is in the coming 10 years that Africa has the real comparative advantage of these markets. So if you act now and jointly with institutional reform, you can grasp this funding.
Thank you. Professor Puschmann.
Madame, s'il vous plaît, excusez-moi, j'aimerais vous dire une chose. Nous avons des gens...
Just one thing. We have countries like mine, like Gabon, like the DRC, who have completed the process, which was imposed on us for accessibility to the sale of carbon with CNUC, which is the UNFCCC, which gives us stages, dictates stages for achieving or accessing this financing. We have finished, we have followed the steps, but they cannot sell their carbon because there is this complexity. It makes our lives difficult. Talk about the adding value to biodiversity carbon. Each time we get to the end of a mechanism, then another door is opened, and then we have to jump through hoops again. So what are the political reforms and the green investments, the most critical ones in your view, Professor?
See, for simplicity and for the audience, let's try to decompose this into 2 parts. One is, we must have the baseline information about natural capital in clear and simple terms, but not depending only on exchange price or the transaction price. Please remember this. If we do that, you will have a very good estimate of natural capital. Now, for Africa, as I said, for 41 countries for which we, UNEP, estimated natural capital, for domestic purposes, I'm coming to your question in a second. For domestic purposes, whether it is innovative approaches, for example, payment of between beneficiary and providers of ecosystem services, if you want the environmental safeguards, if you want a real reliable cost-benefit analysis of infrastructure project, for example. I heard that there was a lot of talk about mobilizing social capital in Africa, in the Africa Outlook report. For all those purposes, having a reliable estimate of natural capital is must. There is no other way. So, Second, there are a lot of global things happening. It's not only biodiversity fund, it's not loss and damage, it's not only nature-based solution, but a range of options where resources have either been committed or are in the process coming, not to mention about Great Green Wall of Africa. For all those things to happen on the ground, you must have reliable information on natural capital. Now, for investment and green, and why I'm saying that this is needed. This is needed not because we fancy about green and whimsical ideas of peacock and parrots and the birds. No, it is related to the life and livelihood of the poorest of the poor who exist in this continent. They exist elsewhere too, but certainly we have chunk of the extreme and marginal poor who are born as poor, spend entire life in poverty, and when they die, they pass the poverty to their kids. In order to help them, we must have information about natural capital. So that is point number one. Second, you mentioned about what are the institutional and regulatory reforms. First and foremost, the statistical infrastructure in the country and the region must be expanded. Without that, it will just remain a talk in the seminar room. Second, capacity. I mean, the system of national accounts, which many of you know in this room, we have been changing it. And UN changes, the bank changes. But when I go to the country, I won't name the country, you know, their statistical officers are using system of national accounts of 1968. Yes, that is true. There is no investment. Most of the neglected department and ministry is a statistical ministry. There is no, I mean, they are just like orphan. You know, the way they account forest, fish stock, topsoil, groundwater, surface water, biodiversity, we need investment. But again, from where the investment will come? Investment will not come from the sky. Investment will come if we show the merit and the potential to generate finance. And that is where having a reliable and credible estimate on natural capital, again, is must. I will stop.
So, to go back to what Professor Pushpam has said, what role can the private sector play to promote green carbon?
Conversation, because the reality is what is not measured is not valued, and what is not valued is not financed, bottom line. So, Professor, I really relate to what you're saying, and I think this is why we have a unique opportunity with the African Development Bank, NAFAD, the new African financial architecture for development. We can really actually leverage this platform set up by the African Development Bank to expand it to something that I'm coming up right now on this stage that I would call AGFA. This will be the Africa Green Finance Architecture. We really need to set up something similar to the NAFAD for this, because that's where we can address the ecosystem and all the issues we're talking about to make this sector bankable, financeable, and sustainable, right? Because it's really about sustainability of the framework that we're discussing here. So the AGFA for us would be critical to put in shape in different forms, we can think about it. And then you talked about the GDP inclusion. These are all elements that are key for you know, the private sector question you asked. That's why I need to mention them, because you know, you take a sector like mining, and this is why I'm saying private sector needs to have a critical space in what we're discussing. You take a sector like mining, it's natural resources, okay? It's not green whatsoever, but it is mining. But you also have 30% of the minerals that are actually needed for the green climate resilience that we can also talk about. But in the mining sector, the largest mining companies operating on the continent, okay, they operate on the basis of reserves. Proven reserves are used to actually value the balance sheet and the financial ratios of those institutions. And those financial ratios and financial statements are reflected in the stock price that's traded on Wall Street or anywhere else in the world. So just to say that the value of the resources on the ground, not exploited yet, okay, are reflected in the stock price of those mining companies. And I'm not going to give examples, but when I used to be on Wall Street, I do remember one of the largest mining companies in the world actually was bidding to take over another large mining company. The only reason the transaction didn't happen is because the real valuation of the minerals reserves they held in one of the African countries, one of the smallest ones on the continent, actually the real valuation came out, even though the reserve was not mined, the mineral reserve was not touched. They were able to show that the valuation of that mine was much bigger than reflected on the balance sheet, and that propped up the stock price, right? So valuation is key, and we can do the same thing in the green, in the, so everything we're talking about today. And then the last word I want to mention is also about, the green ecosystem. When I talk about this AGFA initiative, is to also understand the lay of the ground and what are the players. Talk about GCF, CIF, and so many other lost and found. There's so many players in the system. Sometimes people are confused how to get access to XYZ. So I think having a proper architecture specifically for Africa, where we know where to go, where to tap in, and then bring on the private sector in that process. Just our particular sector at Shelter Afrique Development Bank, we focus on financing affordable housing and urban infrastructure across the continent. We were created by the African Development Bank more than 40 years ago, based in Nairobi, and we have 44 member states that are shareholders of Shelter Afrique Development Bank. So same shareholders of AfDB, the image of AfDB, but just for this sector. 40% of green gas emissions comes from buildings globally, right? So in Africa today, we have more than 50 million housing deficits. Exactly, talk about 53 million, 56 million housing deficits. If you have to rebuild or build those houses on the continent with bricks and mortar, traditional construction materials, etc., the climate footprint will negate most of the efforts that are being done in other sectors. So this is why our particular sector is so key to make sure we're rebuilding our cities sustainably. And this is a huge pipeline for green climate financing. And this is exactly why we are actually issuing in the capital markets across the continent, in local currency, sustainability bonds, right? We are about to conclude one in the CFA zone in West Africa with BRVM. We are doing the same thing in East Africa, in 4 markets, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania. And those will be sustainability bonds, which include green and social, because we're talking about affordable housing. And we'll bring on board our private clients.
I'll hand over the floor to, thank you. I'll hand over the floor to Valerie Letty. You heard him. You've heard from the mouth of the minister. The carbon market is flooding Africa, given that Africa is not taken into account. So what do we need to have a performing carbon credit market, and that would be of service to Africa? Thank you. This comes to the quality of, boils down to the quality of data. As far as international cooperation goes, we can continue to support them through capacity building so that this natural value is properly measured, and this can be done at several levels. If we take into account the circumstances, we look at the quality of the market and as well as the type of investments. So we can, as international corporations, help with these carbon bonds, and working together with local banks to provide guarantees, and with the support of the African Development Bank, we can launch these different bonds. We also have environmental programs that are linked to these bonds that can make them bankable, link them to estimated costs that are integrated on natural capital issues. And also carbon credits could be used. That said, it is not only through bilateral cooperation that we can achieve these. Markets need to be properly structured. Regulation needs to be ideal by way of certification, so that there should be some kind of trust to attract investment. And so we can help to a certain aspect by getting together the different actors. Thank you. So we are coming to the end of this panel discussion. We have 6 minutes left. Last question, what recommendation, what do you expect from the African Development Bank regarding these discussions? Recommendation, expectations? Madam Minister, I'd like to start by thanking the African Development Bank. It is one of the rare banks that is actually close to states, and we at the Congo Basin, we work with the African Development Bank and the Bank for Central African States, who have understood this issue. We have just finished a roundtable with donors for 17 countries that make up the Congo Basin, and we have the African Development Bank as a major partner, and we ask them to support us to put in place in our countries the necessary legislation on green and blue economies. In my ministry, I actually deal with the sustainable development and reforms, and as part of the reforms, we can put in place a circular economy, which is something concrete. And this roundtable is not complicated. We have a thematic commission. We have a blue fund. And we are trying to make some of these instruments credible. And some of these instruments were actually drawn up by the World Bank and international partners, and we are dealing with partners from the North who were more or less reserved, instead of helping us work on the achievements we have already established, rather than put or impose certain tools which does not meet the vision and needs of Africans. But Africans have said we have an investment plan, and I'm insisting on the basic document, which are the NDCs, which help us identify indicators and provides practical statistics. So we have all this data, and we need to strengthen all of this. So this is where we need the assistance of the African Development Bank.
Remember, in 2024, in October, during the COP29, the African Development Bank was leading when a report on valuing, the natural capital and the integrating into the economy in the African context. The African Development Bank was leading. And what I would like to highlight, maybe is, let's say that, can we go from those, publications, reports, to concrete actions? First of all, we've highlighted the barriers and the gaps when it comes to having the natural capital integrated within economic systems when it comes to African context. So then going forward, maybe the next action and steps will be to say, how do we operationalize the findings from that report? First of all, do we have the required resources, the financing? means the resources required just to institutionalize the natural capital accounting where it started. And from those resources, what do we need more? First of all, we highlighted the capacity needed. We highlighted the data needed, having the required data systems as well, and having also I mean, the capacity, the data, and the expertise needed as well. So I think going forward, the African Development Bank would need to look into those key things just to make sure that what was really published and agreed during the COP, and that there was a presidential sessions as well, lead to concrete actions. Thank you.
Valérie pardon.
Valerie Letty. I have 3 points. The African Development Bank has a crucial role to play as far as capacity building, statistical capacity building is concerned. They can also support the countries that are committed on the African continent to be a part of this process. We know the experience of Switzerland, that it is necessary to be able to move forward when it has to do with financial flows. We need to support countries to move forward through partial accounts, rather than wait to have a global picture, so we can support them in other areas. And I think the African development can play this role. And finally, Switzerland as a shareholder can make sure that climate change, biodiversity, be taken into account in its strategies. Thank you, Professor Pushman.
Yeah, thanks very much. 3 things, I think. Number one, the estimate which I was referring earlier for 41 countries of Africa, the wealth estimate. From 1990 to 2020, the growth in GDP per capita, per head GDP, has been 1.6% annual for that 30 years period. But wealth has only increased 0.7% per annum, wealth per capita. So GDP and wealth is being mixed up. And this decline in, lower rate of wealth per capita is due to the fact that produced capital has gone up for Africa, human capital has gone up, but natural capital has declined continuously. What it means that we have not invested enough in the restoration and the drivers which are causing the loss to the natural capital. So we need investment. Second, I said about that, but again reiterate, we need capacity. Third, we must move beyond GDP. GDP is good, we should have idea about it, but if you really want to say something about sustainability, well-being and prosperity of people, GDP is inadequate. Finally, I come from a country, a small country, known as India, where 1.47 billion people live. You know what is happening right now? Entire country has heat waves. People are dying on the streets. And there is a 50% decline in labor productivity. That is the summer. During winter, due to PM 2.5, a child goes to their school, and by the time she or he comes back, they have taken 18 cigarettes. So that is the decline in human capital. So if you don't invest in the wealth restoration, wealth creation, including natural capital restoration, I think you cannot ensure sustainability of society and well-being of the people. So we must focus adequately on creating capacity and inviting investments that is not beyond national government, private sector, civic society, and some global funding like why not sovereign wealth fund Africa should claim from there? But then we must have data, we must have estimate, and we must have number in place which the world can trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Tierno Habib Al.
Tierno Habib, in 2 words, recommendations to the African Development Bank or your expectations. Thank you, ma'am. I think we must go from a diagnosis basis to make a recommendation. First, it's evident that Africa is rich, its subsoil is very rich but poor in the liquidity aspect. Secondly, these resources are undervalued. That's the first diagnosis. And these resources are poorly funded. Africa is poorly funded. And thirdly, we don't include these resources in our national wealth. So like I mentioned earlier, we need to put in place a framework, a new framework to develop everything that has to do with green financing, which is what I refer to as ACFA, Africa Green Finance Architecture, where all our institutions would be involved, Shelter, AfDB, Afrexim Bank, we would create alliances. We have 13 institutions and who work closely with the AfDB, given that they created all of us. So if we create this ACFA, that would serve as a platform like NAFAD to work on all these different aspects. I mean, this is the key area where we believe there's a lot of risk is pollution. We talked about a lot of carbon emissions that is caused by building, and given that there is a housing deficit, about 53 million people need housing, and the carbon footprint as well. There's a lot of things to be done, and we at Shelter Africa we work with a lot of people across Africa, and we can set up a green fund for urban development and a development across the entire region. And our ultimate goal will be a green development bank that will deal with climate issues. So ACFA is what I'm putting down on the table for our colleagues at the African Development Bank. Professor Schuller? In 3 words to wrap up, contributions and expectations. 3 words, because we have exceeded our time, so very quickly.
I think we should all recognize that we are at a unique point in history here. The stars have aligned. We have the political commitment, so Dr. Rivera was talking about that. We have this opportunity of the rollout of the 2025 SNA, the System of National Account, that includes all these values. So now is the time. And you are asking about the expectations on the African Development Bank. I've taken this week to take stock of what is happening, and it's fantastic. So the African Development Institute is now ready to go with the Natural Capital Academy, because as you probably, many of you heard, I think it was the president of Botswana, he was mentioning all these different kinds of capacity, the super capacity in the end. I mean, we need that capacity for the development of the continent, and the African Development Institute can be part of that. Then, of course, the statistics department, they are just eager to implement well, first of all, Pushpan was talking about the 68, but we should get it up to 2025. But of course, that needs the commitment from all the member countries to really invest in this. And also then, of course, add this specialization. We had a community of practice NCA seminar yesterday. It was mentioned only 3.2 people are actually working on these kinds of accounts in countries in Africa, per country. So there is so much more. And then, of course, Natural Capital and Innovation Center that are already leading the way to get climate finance and so on, drawing on these resources. So the bank is already doing a lot, and together with the member countries, with the international community, with donors pitting in, we can make this happen. And as we have heard today, it is the right thing to do.